What's up, guys? I'm back with another video. This is the fight against poverty, and today we have a exciting topic that I found exciting, and the title is "The Thought of Inflation and National Debt Met with Some Negation." So I'm gonna start out by telling you guys I thought of the word negation right on the spot when I was thinking about inflation and the national debt. Negation, I looked it up. I just thought of it on the spot, that word. And that word means negation, the action or operation of negating or making negative doctrine or statement. And to negate means to deny the existence or truth of, to cause to be ineffective or invalid or nullified. And I looked up nullified to break down what it actually meant. And to nullify means to make null or valueless. And I broke down that, and null means having no legal or binding force, invalid, void, amounting to nothing. So just that thought, it amounts to nothing. That's what I was trying to hint at. And the thought of it and being afraid of it for the future, when it comes to making laws and legislation, it's negating. It's a bit negating because it means nothing. It's valueless. The thought of it. You can only be in the present and make certain laws and legislations. That's what Congress has to get to the head. And with this picture, it says inflation as the shark, and notice it's just words. It's not an actual shark. So it's the fear that the shark is out to get us, and that it's in the shape of the shark. But really, it means no harm. And we're gonna find out later in this presentation that inflation can be good and bad. It could be either or you can be in the middle, like the United States is, with the Federal Reserve setting the inflation rate at 2% to try to maintain the economy. So we have that protection, and they lower interest rates and lower interest rates, make them higher. And we're gonna learn more about that in this video. But that's what I was going for. It says, well, my head is still above water. And that's just saying, like, my head's gonna be fine, but my wages, he has a shirt that says wages. My wages are gonna get eaten by this shark. The thought of the shark, the thought of it. So that's just met with some negation. It's I'm gonna read the definition again. Negation, the action or operation of negating or making it negative. You making that the thought is making it negative, a negative outcome. You thinking it's going to be a negative outcome. And to negate, I broke down that to deny the existence or truth, to cause to be ineffective or invalid, nullify. And nullify, I broke it down to make null or valueless, having no legal or binding force, invalid, void, amounting to nothing, insignificant. It's insignificant to even have that thought when making these laws and legislations, when you constantly bring it up, like Joe Manchin and Christian Cinema talking about the inflation is gonna go rampant, and the national debt is gonna go rampant. But the truth is, we have the potential to borrow more money because the GDP rate is so low, and we're gonna find out what the GDP is later on in this presentation. And interest rates are low, so why not borrow more money if the interest rates are low as of right now during the pandemic? So meaning that we don't have to pay interest rates. So that's what I was hinting at. You know, I got my dictionary out for it. I worked hard. I've been up for a minute, but hope you guys enjoyed this video. Just stay tuned. On to the next slide.
Millions of Americans are receiving stimulus checks worth up to $1,400 each. You must be one of them. It's all part of President Biden's $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan.
The American Rescue Plan is already doing what it was designed to do, to make a difference in people's everyday lives.
But you might have also heard people say that if all that money gets spent, the economy will overheat and we'll get inflation. In this video, we'll answer the question of whether stimulus checks will lead to inflation. Short answer, it could, but not necessarily. And the reason is that the link between stimulus checks and inflation isn't direct. There's a lot of other things going on at the same time. First of all, not all of the checks are going to be spent. Some people who didn't lose their jobs and are doing pretty well will save their money instead. You know, put it in their 401k. Or they'll use the money to pay off their credit card bills or other debts. So if that money doesn't get spent, then it won't generate economic activity, and it therefore will not cause any inflation. However, some people will spend the checks, perhaps on new furniture, or a car, or on a trip, or they could use it to pay more for their rent or groceries. And remember, this isn't the only spending going on. There's also billions of dollars being sent out by the federal government as additional unemployment insurance. They're also sending out money to state and local governments. There's money being sent out to help small businesses hold on to or hire workers. Also, people have a lot of savings stored up from last year's stimulus bills as well, and just waiting for the virus to end and for businesses to reopen so they can go out and spend that money. And when it happens, businesses will need to go out and hire back a lot of the workers who got laid off last year. So there will be a lot of spending and hiring going on, not just because of the stimulus checks, but for other reasons too. Will that be enough to overheat the economy? Let's step back for a moment and ask how overheating takes place. Inflation happens when the demand for goods and services runs ahead of the economy's capacity to supply those goods and services with its current labor force. Think of the economy's capacity like a container. The demand is like water going into that container. If people go out and spend their stimulus checks, that starts to fill up the container. Businesses go out and hire workers who go out and spend their paychecks, and that also helps to fill the container. There's millions of workers out of a job, thousands of businesses that are idle. So we can have lots of spending and lots of hiring and the economy running out of capacity or the container filling up with water. Not until the container overflows do you get inflation. Now you may have noticed that the prices for some things are already going up, for airline tickets, and gasoline, and lumber. That's not really inflation. Inflation is when most prices are going up, not just a few, but when they're going up year after year.
So with the prices of gas, people always talk about how it's Biden's fault, and it's due to inflation, as you just heard. And this is from Wall Street Journal. This guy's from Wall Street Journal. That's not because of inflation. And we're going to find out why in just a second.
What you're seeing right now are just one-time only price increases in industries that have specific bottlenecks.
And I looked up bottlenecks. In my dictionary. I looked up bottlenecks. Bottlenecks, a narrow passage or point of congestion. Something that obstructs or impedes. Obstructs meaning it gets in the way. Impedes. We're going to look that up real quick. Impede. Impeding, to interfere with the progress of. So, something that obstructs, gets in the way, or impedes. Impedes means to interfere with the progress of. I wish I can rewind what he just said, but they have bottlenecks, certain things obstructing the way things are going in the economy, and it's not really due to inflation, basically.
So right now, the stimulus checks are probably not going to cause inflation. Here's why. Remember what I said about the economy being like a container? The container is still a long way from being full. There are more than 9 million fewer people with jobs now than before the pandemic. There's a lot of slack in the labor market. It's going to take a lot of spending, a lot of hiring over many, many months to start to run out of workers. Economists don't really know how much capacity the economy has. It's like they don't know how big the container is. You might run the water long enough to fill the container and discover that the container has stretched and gotten bigger. In other words, we may think we can only get the unemployment rate down to, say, 4%, and then we'll run out of workers. But maybe as unemployment moves down, we'll find a lot more people coming into the labor force to look for jobs. One final point. Inflation is partly psychological. Businesses are more likely to raise prices and wages if they think everyone else will do the same thing.
That's the negation. I looked it up again. Negation. 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 The action or operate of negating or making a negative doctrine or statement. To negate, to deny the existence or truth of, to cause to be ineffective or invalid. Nullify. And nullify means to make null or valueless also. And null having no legal or binding force, invalid, void, amounting to nothing. And the psychological, that's something that's worthless, doesn't mean anything. Basically, we thinking that these stimulus checks is gonna cause inflation, and really that's lack of understanding and stopping the passage to getting people money that they need to survive and keeping, like, the stimulus checks have helped people, stay afloat and to get back to afloat or to even come close to being afloat. So, it helped poverty out a lot. And, hopefully Congress sees that these checks are a way to start abolishing poverty, to get rid of it, what Martin Luther King was talking about.
In other words, they expect higher inflation. They'll act in a way that makes higher inflation more likely. But inflation has been low for years. In fact, it's too low. Some observers target 2%, which they think is ideal. Inflation has been so low for so long, people will assume it will stay that way. So I just explained why the stimulus checks aren't likely to produce inflation soon. And maybe in a few years, we'll get inflation. How would that happen? Well, if we succeed in vaccinating most of the country, the virus will go away and most of the economy will reopen. So people will start spending again big time. And maybe those stimulus checks won't be the last of the stimulus. President Biden is talking about a big infrastructure package.
It creates jobs and it makes us a lot more competitive around the world with the best infrastructure in the world.
So, in a year or two, unemployment could fall close to 3% for the first time in half a century. That would look like a labor market that has run out of slack, like the container that started to overflow. One important reason why we haven't had high inflation in a long time. The Federal Reserve didn't let it happen. As soon as it thought the economy was overheating because unemployment was low, it raised interest rates. And often that put us into a recession. Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Fed, says this time is different. Because inflation has been below 2% for so long, Powell wants inflation to actually go above 2% for a while. That's why he's keeping interest rates at zero, and that's why he plans to keep them close to zero until 2024 at least.
We're not done, and I'd hate to see us take our eye off the ball before we actually finish the job.
And another thing that's different. For a long time, all the politicians and the experts said keeping inflation low should be the priority. Not any longer. Now, President, Congress, and the Fed say low unemployment, especially for disadvantaged groups, is more important. Even if inflation starts to look like a problem, maybe the Fed will be reluctant to raise interest rates. Also, those stimulus checks, that's not really free money. The government borrowed it, and as a result, the national debt is sky high. If the Fed raised interest rates to fight inflation, paying the interest on that debt quickly gets very expensive. So if the Fed ever decides it needs to raise interest rates, there will be a lot of politicians hoping it doesn't, and they may be pressuring it not to.
As you can see, this is from Wall Street Journal. And he said at the end, Jerome Powell, chairman of the Fed, he actually wants inflation to go above 2%. That's why he's keeping the interest rates at 0. So there's room to operate, to make something happen with poverty. And there's room, and we're going to find out in this next video that the national debt isn't as bad as it seems, and we can do more borrowing or spending. But yeah, we can do more borrowing, and we can use that for programs to help abolish poverty, which has been around for a long time. It's been generation after generation born into poverty, and that needs to change in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So let's see what this next video got.
This is the national debt, the total amount that we as a country owe to our creditors, the combined sum of all our annual federal budget deficits lumped together. You might have heard about it. Our main sources are concerns the national debt.
The deficit and how we're going to pay for that. The national debt is at an all-time high.
Here in the U.S., we have by far the national debt in the world, and right now it's the highest it's ever been. Even when compared to the massive size of the U.S. economy and the debt-to-GDP ratio, we're still pretty close to record highs. You've probably seen these charts before. They're favorites on cable shows and newspaper columns. They even make the occasional appearance on the House floor. But what if I told you maybe they don't matter? Let's back up.
Tonight I want to talk about the debate we've been having in Washington over the national debt.
After the Great Recession, the Obama administration spent hundreds of billions of dollars to revive the U.S. economy, which sent the national debt soaring. Economists and politicians were worried about what would happen with the U.S. borrowing and spending so much so fast. Would interest rates spike? Would inflation take off? Would the economy come crumbling down, crushed by the weight of an unprecedented fiscal burden? It did not. And inflation didn't take off, and interest rates on the government debt did not spike. In fact, and this is key, interest rates fell, and then it kept falling. The low rates are going to be with us for a lot more.
Low rates, zero rates, forever in the debt.
Very low interest rates for a very long time.
When the dust settled from the financial crisis, the biggest criticism was that the government hadn't done enough and should have borrowed and spent even more to speed the recovery along. Now, enter two famous economists.
So they're basically saying back in the 08-09 recession that the government, some people are saying the government should have borrowed more because interest rates were so low and the GDP also was low. We're going to find out later what the GDP is. But basically, it's a difference between what Biden administration and some of Trump's presidency have done during the pandemic. A more speedy type of recovery, putting money in people's pockets and trying to stimulate the economy. It seems the government learned from its mistake back from the 09-08 recession. And they may have prevented a long-lasting recession. There was a bit of a recession, but only lasted for a year. It didn't last more. If anything, it lasted for a year, the maximum. But you could kind of say we're still in it, but not really, because unemployment is back down, and it was high. It was at over 20% at a point in time. I remember. No, or it might have been at 14%. But it's a difference between what they're doing now, from what what they did back in 08 and 09.
Larry Summers, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary, and Olivier Blanchard, the former chief economist of the IMF. At a 2017 conference about lessons learned from the Great Recession, the asked a big question. If you're borrowing money to help your economy grow, and the growth you're getting is higher than the interest you pay, why not just spend more money? Here's how Blanchard thinks. It's still an issue that you have monthly payments. If you never repay the debt to GDP ratio, will still eventually converge. It will never explode. It's everything I can be off. The idea that federal debt is going so bad is not a new one. It's a core belief of modern monetary theory, a school of economic thinking that's been gaining traction over the last few years as the debt has gotten larger. But what Blanchard and Summers said was, rather than focusing so much on discharge, we should be thinking about this debt, the interest that the government pays on all that debt as a percentage of GDP. Because interest rates have stayed so low, the cost of paying for the U.S. debt has also stayed low, even as the debt itself has taken off. So, if you look at discharge, you would find the trend much less alarming. But you can see that how much of the goal is the big implication is this. If countries with super low interest rates, like the U.S., can afford to spend a lot more and run up much bigger deficits without facing such negative consequences. And that idea has caught on among economists and investors who started coming around to a whole new way of thinking about government borrowing. And top economic policymakers haven't been far behind. U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen gave testimony in March, and she was asked specifically if the growing debt is cause for concern. Her response might sound familiar. This is that relative of not going up at all. And so I think that's a more meaningful metric of dispersion of the debt on society. This change helps explain the Biden administration's approach to the economic recovery. They're taking what economists see as a calculated risk, a debt made in trillions of dollars, which are no less than the future of a nation and of a global financial system built around borrowed money. And for the moment, the interest rate still so low, the debt appears to be paying off.
I mean, just think about it. If you taking out a loan and the interest rates are at zero, you know what I'm saying? You're gonna want to keep borrowing money. I mean, that is, I mean, common sense once you think about it. But yeah, the fact that we could have borrowed more money and still can borrow more money, despite what the debt is the country is in, um, because interest rates are so low, we're capable of doing that. We have that capability to borrow more money, and in this case, what we're discussing is for poverty. It will put money into people's pockets for different, like whether they want to fund different programs like stimulus checks, guarantee income, uh, student debt relief, just different things like that. Making college free, at least for the state locals, making college free, things like that. It's just a lot of things that they have an opportunity to do with them being able to borrow more money. So if interest rates are low and the GDP is also low, that's that's what it's showing, that it's possible to borrow more money without having severe consequences. So, with that being said, we're gonna move on to the next slide. So this slide is going to be focused on places around the world that have the highest and lowest inflation, and places that are in the middle. And we're gonna read more about this. I'm not gonna speak too soon, so I'm just gonna let you guys listen to what the article has to say. In economic terms, inflation is the rate at which the general prices for goods and services rise in a given country. A volatile metric, inflation that can rise and fall rapidly depending upon economic conditions and the measures a government chooses to control or counteract them. Inflation is connected to the economic principles of supply and demand and can be viewed positively or negatively depending on the specific situation and the rate of change. For example, a small amount of inflation is usually viewed as a signal that the country economy is growing and its residents have adequate income, good things, both good things. However, excess inflation happens when prices too rise faster than wages, causing currency to lose value. The worth of a single unit of currency, a dollar, a euro, etc., becomes less than it was previously, and the purchasing power of the country's currency is decreased. Conversely, too little inflation can also be troubling indication that a country's economy is stagnant and not enough people have enough work. So you got to be kind of in the middle. You can't be too low or too high. And I think that's why the U.S. put a target for 2%. It's kind of like in the middle. And, you know, there may be a low ball even at that. Considering the GDP, which we're going to learn about soon. There are 3 inflation indexes: the Consumer Price Index, CPI, the Wholesale Price Index, WPI, and the Producer Price Index, PPI. The CPI is measured that examines the weighted average prices of primary needs such as transportation, food, medical care at the consumer retail level. The WPI measures and tracks price changes at the producer or wholesale level before the goods reach the consumer. PPI is a family of metrics that measure price changes from perspectives of the seller producer rather than the buyer/consumer. Causes of inflation. Inflation is classified into 3 types: demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, and built-in inflation. All 3 of these are related to the equilibrium between the supply of money and the supply of goods in the country's economy. Demand pull inflation occurs when the demand for goods and services, in other words, the overall amount of money and or credit people have spent, increases quicker than the economy's production capacity. Demand is high, but supply can't keep up, so prices rise. Okay, we can understand that. The rising prices cause some buyers to drop out of the market, which decreases demand, reestablishes the balance between demand and supply. Cost push inflation occurs as a result of the increase in cost of production. For example, if the raw materials used to create product increase in price, the price for the final good rises as producers pass their costs on the consumer. Built-in inflation occurs due to expectations that inflation will continue, so wages must rise in order to maintain status quo. As the prices of goods and services increase, labor expects to be paid more to maintain their standard of living. This is what commonly known as a cost of living. COLA is what we call it in the United States, raised in the United States. As a result of the rise in labor costs, the consumer prices for the goods or services that labor produces or provides also increase. Top 10 countries with the highest inflation rates. Venezuela, outstanding. That's at 1,198%. And then we got Sudan, Lebanon, Syria, Suriname, Zimbabwe, Argentina, Turkey, Iran, and Ethiopia. And I think Turkey, that's pretty high. I heard things about Turkey and how their inflation is crazy. So you can only imagine the other 7. You know, the United States is nowhere near none of these. Not even at 20%. So with that being said, you know, it's not all that bad. We're not in the worst predicament possible. So you got to give credit to the Federal Reserve, and they're doing their job and have a good target with 2%. Oh crap. Okay, back to what I was doing. With an inflation rate that has soared above 1,000,000% in recent years. Oh, that's 1,000,000%. I didn't even know that. That's bad. Venezuela has the highest inflation rate in the world. At times, prices in Venezuela, that's not funny, but Venezuela have changed so rapidly that stores stopped putting price tags on the merchandise and instructed customers to simply ask employees what each item cost that day. The level of runaway inflation, and we learned about that, is known as hyperinflation, an economic crisis that is usually caused by the government overspending, often as a result of war, a regime change, or socio-economic circumstances that decrease funding from tax revenue and printing large amounts of additional money to cover its expenditures. Gotta give credit to the Federal Reserve for that, for the United States. So, they definitely print money. They definitely bail us out when we need it. Venezuela economy was once the envy of South America, blessed with large per capita wealth due to having the largest oil reserves in the world. However, such heavy reliance upon petroleum incomes left the country particularly vulnerable to fluctuations in oil prices during the 1980s and 1990s, when oil prices plunged from $100 per barrel in U.S. currency in 2014 to less than $30 by early 2016. So with the U.S. currency being the de facto, you know what I'm saying, being the highest currency there is, you know, that shows you that their economy was left to pretty much out there and dangle. The countries, and they're probably not going to do well either, because oil is, you know, is getting cheaper. It's getting, we're pretty abundant everywhere. So the country's economy spiraled and has yet to fully recover. Sudan had an inflation rate of 340% at the start of 2022, ranking the second highest in the world. Inflation in Sudan has increased drastically in recent years, driven by food, beverages, and black market for U.S. dollars. There go the U.S. dollars. The rising inflation became so bad that it sparked protests and ultimately the ousting of President Omar al-Bashir in April 2019. Sudan's transitional authorities are now tasked with turning around an economy plagued by years of mismanagement. So, you know, these are just examples to show you that the U.S. is not in that bad of a shape. The countries with the lowest inflation rate in the world often have negative inflation rates, which is called deflation. So, Sudan deflation increases the value of sudden deflation increases the value of country's money, enabling more goods and services to be purchased with the same amount of currency. Deflation generally arises from the opposite scenario as inflation. In other words, when the supply of goods and services outpaces the supply of available money in the economy, causing prices to decrease as a result. Deflation can also occur when buying power grows due to reduction in money supply and or a decrease in supply of credit, both of which enhance the value of existing currency. Top countries with the lowest inflation rate: Rwanda at 2%, Chad, Maldives, Gabon, Japan, Bahrain, Fiji, Vanuatu, Bolivia, and Saudi Arabia. You know, Saudi Arabia is not the best place to live, so they're pretty undeveloped. And a lot of these places are undeveloped except Japan. I'm not sure about the other places, but what is the ideal rate of inflation? If both too much and too little inflation can both lead to negative conditions, what is the ideal level of inflation? It depends. Individual countries will each have their own unique targets based upon their specific economic circumstances. That said, the United States Federal Reserve has long-standing target of 2% inflation per year, which has determined is the rate that best attains policy main goals of maintaining consumer price stability and maximizing employment. I think that's it for this article, but we learn a little something. If inflation is too low, which is deflation, it can have negative consequences too. Shorting your money supply and high inflation. You've seen in what's the call? Venezuela, they had to make prices the day of, and that's the consumer can't go to the store and be like, oh, I'm finna buy this for this amount, or budget their money properly. So they're gonna end up their budgeting is gonna be all off. That's what I learned from this article. I thought it was interesting, so we're gonna go on to the next article. So with this slide, we're gonna talk about the U.S. national debt exceeds 30 trillion for the first time, and from the video, we know that's not too bad. It's not bad news. I mean, it may be the highest in the world for a country, but the GDP, we're gonna learn about the exact definition and what it means later on in this presentation. The United States national debt exceeds 30 trillion for the first time in history, according to the Treasury Department figures released on Tuesday. Let me close this. The national debt is now about double China's entire gross national product. The sobering milestone comes after the federal government spent trillions of dollars to stimulate the economy and lessen the economic blow that came with the pandemic. Get past this video. The milestone of 30 trillion debt should be a giant red flag for all of us about America's future economic health, generational equity, and the role in the world, said Michael Peterson, CEO of Peter G. Peterson Foundation Group that works to raise awareness about the debt. Congress aims to complete U-turn on decades on economic relations. Oh, that's something else. Our high and rising debt makes us less prepared for the next pandemic, less secure against future adversaries, less resilient to changing climate, and less able to build the strong, inclusive economy that we all want for the next generation, he added. And they must not know about that theory they mentioned in the video about how the debt doesn't really, we have room to spend more because of the GDP. So I'm gonna continue reading. Most of the trillion dollars, that's where I'm at, $1 trillion that Congress spent sending out 3 personal stimulus checks to people, propping up businesses and providing jobs benefits during the worst of the pandemic was financed through borrowing rather than being offset through revenues. A fact that raised the national debt to 30 trillion mark much sooner than expected. The current gross national debt burden, which represents the debt the government owes its creditors, is greater than the entire U.S. economy. The national debt differs from the federal debt held by the public. which represents only the amount of government bonds held by the public and not money the government owes itself. That number is lower than 23.5 trillion. News that the U.S. crossed 30 trillion threshold comes as Federal Reserve unwinds its ultra-loose monetary policies because they got that 2% 2% inflation rate. That's their mark. Policies and prepares to raise the federal funds rate for the first time in years to combat soaring inflation. It's not exactly soaring compared to other countries. From what we read from places like Venezuela. So, I mean, I think the Federal Reserve is doing what they need to do. They know that's their job. So, increasing borrowing costs will make it even more difficult to finance the debt. It doesn't mean a short-term crisis, but it does mean we are going to be poorer in the long term. David Kelly, chief global strategist at JP Morgan Asset Management, told CNN the U.S. owes a lot of its debt to foreign investors, particularly China and Japan. That means American taxpayers will be paying for the retirement of people in China and Japan who are our creditors. During a meeting last week, top central bank officials indicated that the first in a series of interest rate hikers will likely come in March. Investors are participating in several rate hikes this year, which could bring the federal funds rate to a range of 1 to 1.25%. I want to watch this video of Joe Manchin, the infamous Joe Manchin. See what he has to say about how things are, because he knows so much and is against the Build Back Better plan. Let's see what he has to say.
Senator Joe Manchin broke the huge news on Fox News Sunday's first airing since Chris Wallace's departure. Asked, what is the state of play on the Build Back Better bill? Manchin upended political Washington.
I've always said this, Brett. If I can't go home and explain it to the people of West Virginia, I can't vote for it. And I cannot vote to continue with this piece of legislation. I just can't. I've tried everything humanly possible. I can't get there.
You're done. This is a no.
This is a no. On this legislation, I have tried everything I know to do.
He cited the same concerns he's had throughout negotiations. Inflation, the rise in debt, COVID's resurgence, a dependence on government the massive bill might engender, and his party's disingenuous promises to fund 3-year programs over 10 years. The White House lashed out at Manchin's bombshell announcement accusing the West Virginian of betrayal. In a lengthy statement, Press Secretary Jen Psaki said, quote, if his comments on Fox and written statements indicate an end to the effort, they represent a sudden and inexplicable reversal of his position and a breach of his commitments to the president. Manchin supporters cried foul at that. Guy Benson typified conservatives' reaction. In this tweet, quote, Manchin literally wrote down what he would support in a document signed by Chuck Schumer months ago. This bill isn't close to what he wrote. His decision is sudden and inexplicable in the same way the bill would cost $0. But some Democrats were fit to be tied. Far-left progressive Ilhan Omar threw out an expletive on live TV as she heard on air of Manchin's no.
I mean, we all knew that Senator Manchin couldn't be trusted. The excuses that he just made, I think, are complete bullshit. First of all, it is not a huge surprise. We have been, and let me be clear, there are 6 of us who have been saying this all along. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Presley, Representative Tlaib, Representative Bowman, Representative Omar, and myself. We have been saying this for weeks that this would happen, and we took the hit.
Other Democrats say the fight is not over, that the bill or components of it still stand a chance of being resurrected. I don't think this is over. Certainly not easy. Not going to be easy. Never was going to be easy. This is just another bump in the road. But that is easier said than done. Any replacement bill could not be taken up until after the new year. And that's an election year. For Democrats to ask an inflation-saddled electorate to pay for the tax increases that would fund any replacement bill may be too risky. Additionally, any new attempts by Democrats to undo the filibuster would be met with massive retaliation should Republicans retake Congress in 2022.
It is difficult to overstate the damage that Manchin's announcement does to the Biden White House. Some political analysts had already been writing the obituary of the administration even before Manchin's Sunday statement. Now you could add Build Back Better to doubts about border policy, inflation, Afghanistan, COVID, and the president's mental fitness. Not to mention the Democrats' intra-party divisions. Doug McKelway for the Washington Executive.
Yeah, to be honest, I just think the people in Congress are cheap with their money. They old of age, stuck in their ways, and they just want to be cheap, and they just not really paying attention to the GDP, which indicates that it's gonna merge with the inflation, and it's gonna we'll basically have money to cover it. We basically have money to cover the debt, and if they can't realize that and they're still stuck in these ways, of course, you know, we're gonna stay stagnant. They're creating a stagnation themselves by holding up these passages. And I'm not, you know, there's probably some things in the legislation that I don't like, but you know, I haven't read everything. But the child tax credits, come on, that's cutting child poverty, which is what this channel is about. I mean, how can you be against that? You know, you talking about inflation, the debt, and there's indicators that we have more than enough to spend. You know, we have more than enough to spend for these things. So it's just proof in the pudding. I'm continue reading this, but I really wanted y'all to see that video. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it for this slide. But yeah. Just not paying attention to the GDP, which I just learned about too. So you can't say, I mean, but once you find out, like, because my whole methodology was, okay, if we're gonna be in debt, we might as well do it together rather than being apart. So that's just how I look at it. But now you figure that we have enough to spend because of the GDP, which we're gonna learn about in a second. Just give it a second. It changes a lot. It changes a lot. You know, we're at the target. We're not like exceedingly high like other places in the world. So, I mean, if that isn't the indicator, like the Federal Reserve is gonna do their job. They have to do a job. They're gonna make sure that we stay in that range of the inflation, that mark that they want to keep 2%. So that's all I got for this slide. And this slide, I decided I looked up what is considered bad inflation. When inflation is above 2%, inflation expectation will rise, and it will be hard to reduce inflation in the future. Keeping inflation less than 2% will keep long-term expectations low. Inflation of over 2% may indicate the economy is overheating and can lead to a boom and bust type of economic cycle. And we learned from the video the cup overflowing, and but in the video it also said while it's overheating, you can realize that, you know, the economy is a lot bigger than you ever thought it was, because you're creating more jobs and you're doing all this. So I mean, it's kind of you gotta test the waters, you know? You gotta test the waters, especially with everything going on. COVID, people losing their jobs, and things like that. Inflation has a lot to do with what's going on. They said it in the video. Maybe when the pandemic stops, it will kind of halts. People are going to spend more money, and that's when inflation can happen. So, yeah, and I looked up on Google, what is the current inflation rate? What is the U.S. current inflation rate? And and last month, this is recent, it was 6.81, and it's not nowhere near Venezuela, by the way. So, and a year ago, and this is still during the pandemic, it was 1.36 because nobody was spending money. So it's kind of a deflation because that's underneath the 2%. So, and the change has been a big change, and it's not. I see it as not necessarily good or bad. It's kind of just like, it's not like we shot up to 14%. It's not like that, you know, or we shot up to 20 or 30 like some of the other countries. I don't think we're at that point yet. So we still have room to operate and create new things and maybe give out more stimulus. And we've seen that the stimulus doesn't really cause inflation. And we learned that what will cause inflation is when the pandemic comes to an end and more people are out spending more money. That's what is going to cause inflation. So that's this slide. And yeah, I learned a lot doing this research, and it's very interesting. Very interesting. So for this slide, we're going to talk about the GDP. People also ask, I'm going to get my red pointer. People also ask, what is a simple definition of GDP? The GDP is the total of all value added created in an economy. The value added means the value of goods and services that have been produced minus the value of goods and services needed to produce them, the so-called intermediate consumption. So if the GDP is low, the cost is low. Meaning, and if inflation is also low, that what I'm getting from this is that we have enough room to spend more, and it still won't have any negative effects when it comes to the national debt. And inflation is not high. We just learn about Venezuela and countries that have low, they have problems creating more money, and that's a problem we don't currently have. So with that being said, there's room to create more. So that's the simplest way I could put it. You know, it is all really confusing. We kind of get twisted a little bit, but it says it right there. You know, so that's this slide, short and simple.